There's a moment I've seen in my office more times than I can count. A mother sits across from me, hands in her lap, and she starts describing what happened. And partway through, she stops, not because she's finished, because she's embarrassed. She's embarrassed to say out loud to a professional, to another adult, what her own child said to her. The words her son used, the tone her daughter took, the look on their face when they said it. And then quietly, almost to herself, she says the thing that actually breaks my heart. I didn't say anything, I just stood there. That silence, that moment where you freeze, where you swallow it, where you tell yourself it's fine, he's stressed, she didn't mean it. That silence is what I want to talk to you about today. Because the silence isn't the problem. The silence is the symptom. And what's underneath it has been building for longer than you want to admit. By the end of this video, you're going to have 4 specific phrases, exact words, the kind you can write on a piece of paper and keep in your pocket. Phrases that don't start arguments, phrases that don't sound like lectures, phrases that work precisely because they do something different from everything you've tried before. But before I give them to you, I need you to understand something about why the things you've already tried haven't worked. Because if you skip that part, the phrases are useless. Stay with me. Every word here matters. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've spent years sitting with people at their most difficult in the middle of relationships that are causing them real pain. And one of the most consistent things I see is this: mothers who are being treated badly by their adult children and who have been told explicitly or implicitly that if they say something about it, they'll make everything worse. So they don't say anything. They absorb it. They explain it away. They build an entire internal architecture of justification. He's under pressure at work. She's going through something. This is just how he is. She doesn't mean it like that. And the behavior doesn't change. It gets a little worse, actually, because behavior that has no consequences has no reason to change. What I've learned and what research in behavioral psychology consistently shows is that people adjust their conduct when the environment around them changes in a concrete, consistent way. Not when the people around them suffer more visibly. Not when someone explains the damage better. When something actually shifts, that's what these 4 phrases do. They shift something. Let me tell you about Margaret first. Margaret came to see me about 2 years ago. She was 58. She had the kind of composure that takes a lot of effort to maintain, the kind where you can tell it's being held together deliberately. Her son Daniel was 31. He'd moved back home briefly during a difficult period in his life, and even after he moved out, the dynamic that had developed during those months had stayed. She described it carefully, like she'd been rehearsing how to make it sound less serious than it was. He interrupted her constantly. When she offered an opinion, he'd say something like, "Mum, you really don't understand how things work now." When she got something wrong, a date, a name, a detail, he'd correct her with a particular brand of contempt that isn't loud, it's quiet, quieter than a shout, the kind that happens in front of other people and makes everyone in the room go very still. She told me about a Sunday lunch where she mentioned she'd been thinking about taking a trip to Italy, something she'd always wanted to do. Daniel looked at her and said, "On your own? Right, that'll last about 3 days." Everyone at the table heard it. No one said anything. Margaret told me she'd laughed, a small, embarrassed laugh, and then changed the subject herself. I asked her one question. When was the last time you told Daniel that what he said wasn't acceptable? She thought about it. She said, "I tell him all the time that it hurts me when he speaks to me like that." I said, "That's not the same thing." The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. And in that silence was everything. What Margaret had been doing for years across dozens of interactions was communicating her pain. And Daniel had been absorbing that information and learning something very specific from it, that he could say what he liked, there would be a brief emotional discomfort, and then everything would reset. There were no new consequences, just the same ones, every time. She'd been teaching him without meaning to, that with her there was a fixed price. a small emotional bill to pay. And then everything continued as before. Here's what I need you to understand about why this happens, and it's uncomfortable, so I'm going to say it plainly. When a mother responds to rudeness with visible pain, with tears, with a raised voice, with a long explanation of how much it hurts the child's brain, processes that as an emotional problem belonging to the mother. She's upset is a different message from "I did something unacceptable." The first one centers the problem in her. The second one puts it where it belongs. This is documented in behavioral psychology going back decades. Ross and Nisbet's work on situational behavior, and more recently research on interpersonal contingencies in family systems, all point to the same pattern. Conduct is regulated by its consequences, not by the emotional distress it causes in others. Which means a son who is rude to his mother and receives tears and then a return to normal the next day has learned nothing that would change his behavior. He has no new information. He has the same information he's always had. What he needs is information that actually updates his model of how this relationship works. That's what the 4 phrases do. But here's what I need you to hear before I give them to you. And this is the part where most mothers want to look away. The dynamic that Margaret was living in, the interruptions, the dismissive tone, the correction in front of others, that didn't start last year. It started much earlier, with a comment she let pass, then a tone she explained away, then something that happened in front of other people that she responded to by changing the subject herself. Week by week, year by year, something that should never have been tolerated became normalized, and the mechanism underneath it was always the same thing: fear. Fear of the argument, fear of the distance, fear that if she said something, she'd lose him. But what she'd actually been losing, quietly, for years, was something else entirely. Her own position in the relationship, her own weight. And Daniel, without consciously deciding to, had learnt to see her as someone without that weight, as a source of emotional reaction, not as a person with a point of view that had to be reckoned with. The 4 phrases don't just change what she says, they change what she is in that relationship. And those are not the same thing. Before I give you the phrases, I want to say something that very few people will tell you directly. These phrases will feel wrong the first time you use them. There will be something in your chest, a tightening, a resistance, and the voice behind that resistance will say, "If I do this, I'll lose him. If I respond like this, she'll think I don't care. If I hold this line, everything will fall apart." That voice feels like wisdom. It has been your guide for years, but that voice is the exact mechanism that has kept this dynamic in place. The fear is real. What it's telling you is not. What you lose if you continue to absorb this without consequence is far more valuable than what you're afraid of losing if you don't: your own dignity. And this is the part that surprises most people: your child's genuine respect. People only value what they can perceive they might lose. What is completely guaranteed, what comes without any conditions, is not valued the way we hope it will be. That's not a flaw in your child's character. That's human psychology. And here's the thing that actually changes everything once you understand it. When Margaret started using these phrases consistently, calmly, without drama, Daniel didn't just start treating her differently. He started seeing her differently. The phrases didn't manipulate him. They gave him accurate information about who she actually was. And that information was new. That's what we're doing here, giving your child accurate information about who you are. 4 phrases. Let's go. Phrase 1. For the moments when the tone is wrong, when there's an eye roll, an interruption, a response delivered with contempt before you've even finished your sentence. The response is this: "When you speak to me like that, I'd rather we continue this conversation another time." That's it. Nothing after it. No explanation of why it hurts. No, "you always do this." Just that in a calm voice, and then stop talking. If you're in person, move to a different space. What this phrase does is place the condition on the behavior, not on your emotional state. It says, what you're doing right now has a concrete, practical consequence. The conversation stops, not with drama, not with a door slam. It simply stops. Margaret used this for the first time 4 days after our session. Daniel called on a Tuesday. They were discussing plans for the weekend, and she mentioned she'd like to come over on Saturday to see the grandchildren. He responded with that tone she knew too well. "Mum, don't complicate things. We've already got stuff on," condescending, like she was a logistical inconvenience. In the past, Margaret would have said, "Oh, all right, love. It's just I haven't seen them in a while." And he would have continued in that tone, and she would have ended the call feeling small. This time she took 2 seconds and said, "When you speak to me like that, I'd rather we continue this conversation another time." Silence. Several seconds of it. Daniel said, "How am I speaking to you?" half surprised, half irritated. She didn't answer the question. She said calmly, "When you want to talk about Saturday, call me." And she ended the call. She told me her hands were trembling for 20 minutes afterward. She said she was certain he wouldn't call for days. He called that same evening, different tone. Asked if Saturday afternoon worked for her. She said yes. Phrase 2. For the moments when your opinion is dismissed. When he corrects you with contempt. When she talks over you or signals through her expression that what you just said wasn't worth hearing. The response is, "You might be right. I see it differently." And then, this is the part that's hardest, don't argue. Don't defend yourself. Don't try to get them to acknowledge that you also have a valid point. Just that. Said calmly, and then let it sit. This phrase is powerful because of what it doesn't do. It doesn't give him the argument he's looking for. It doesn't validate the dismissal, but it also doesn't escalate. What it does is assert your perspective with a steadiness that communicates one very specific thing. You don't need their approval to know what you think. For a child who's used to their mother either backing down or getting into a prolonged debate, this is completely new information. Margaret used this at a family Sunday lunch about 3 weeks in. There was a conversation about something in the news. Daniel said, "Mum, you genuinely don't understand how this works," in front of his partner and 2 children. Margaret looked at him quietly and said, "You might be right. I see it differently," and then asked Daniel's partner how the kids' new school term was going. What happened in the seconds that followed was something Margaret hadn't expected. Daniel had nothing to say. The phrase had given him nowhere to go, no argument to dismantle, no emotional response to manage. Just a position, held calmly, and then the conversation moved on. Later that evening, after Margaret had left, Daniel's partner sent her a message. It said, "You seem different lately. Something's changed in you." Margaret read me that message in our next session with her eyes bright, not from sadness. Phrase 3. For the moments when it's more than a tone, when there's a comment designed to diminish you, when something is said in front of others or in private that crosses a line clearly enough that you both know it crossed it, the response is, "What you just said isn't something I'm going to let go of. When you're ready to speak differently, I'll be here." This phrase has 3 deliberate parts. First, it names the behavior without describing the emotional damage. It says what you did is the issue, without centering how hurt you are. Second, it sets a behavioral condition for the conversation to continue, not when you apologize that starts a negotiation, just when you're ready to speak differently. A behavior, not a feeling. Third, it keeps the door open without begging. "I'll be here," says you're not going anywhere. But the conversation in these terms ends here. The Sunday lunch Margaret had told me about months earlier, the Italy comment. "On your own? That'll last 3 days. The table going quiet, everyone watching." By the time something like that happened again at another family gathering, month 2, Margaret was ready. Daniel made a remark. She let the silence hold for 3 seconds. Then she looked at him directly and said, with the voice she'd been practicing, "What you just said isn't something I'm going to let go of. When you're ready to speak differently, I'll be here. She got up, went to help in the kitchen, calm. Daniel's brother, across the table, said to him quietly, audible enough, "That was out of order, mate." Daniel didn't apologize that day. But when he said goodbye, he held the hug a moment longer than usual. Phrase 4. This one is different. It's not a response to something that's already happened. It's for when you feel yourself starting to collapse, when the old pattern tries to pull you back. When he pushes harder, or she finds a new way to transfer the problem back onto you, because they will try. This is almost universal. When a family system that has operated one way for years begins to change, the other person, without consciously deciding, to pushes harder against the change, to test whether it's real. The phrase is internal before it's spoken. It's this: I am not reacting to my pain, I am responding to the behavior. Say it to yourself before you open your mouth. It resets something. It moves you from the part of your brain that's flooded with feeling into the part that can choose, and then use whichever of the first 3 phrases applies. Margaret hit this moment at week 3. Daniel called with an attitude that was, she said, almost deliberately provocative. He interrupted her twice in 2 minutes. She used phrase 1. And he responded with something new. "What's wrong with you lately? You're being very touchy." This is the moment most mothers step back, because you're being touchy is a move that transfers the problem. Suddenly the issue is her sensitivity, not his behavior. She nearly gave in. She told me she felt enormous pressure to say, "You're right, I'm sorry, I'm being silly, let's carry on." Instead she said, "You might be right, I see it differently," and waited. He muttered something, changed the subject. The call continued with a different quality, because her response hadn't given him the control he was reaching for. Let me tell you honestly what happens when mothers use these 4 phrases consistently. Because if I don't tell you the full picture, I'm not being straight with you. In roughly half the cases I've worked with, the dynamic shifts significantly. The child adjusts their behavior, not instantly, not perfectly, but in ways that are real and that hold. The mother recovers genuine weight in the relationship. This is what happened with Margaret and Daniel. By month 4, he called her one afternoon with no practical reason, no logistics to manage, no plans to coordinate. He called to ask how she was, and then he asked for her advice about something at work. She told me that during that call, he listened to her for the entire answer without interrupting once. That's the result that's possible. It's real, but it's not guaranteed. In about a third of cases, there's a partial improvement. The rudeness decreases but doesn't disappear. The relationship stabilizes into something more functional, but doesn't reach the warmth the mother hopes for. That result is still valuable. A relationship that functions with basic respect, even without deep intimacy, is infinitely better than one that causes damage every week. And in the remaining cases, and I'm telling you this because not telling you would be dishonest, the child doesn't change, the distance increases. I knew a woman, 63, whose son essentially withdrew when she stopped tolerating his behavior without consequence. The calls became less frequent. The visits stopped. She came back and asked me, "Did I do the wrong thing by trying?" I told her no, and I want you to hear this. If a child only maintains contact with their mother when they can treat her badly without consequence, what existed before wasn't a relationship. It was a power dynamic wearing the costume of one. When the dynamic changes and what remains is silence, the silence wasn't created by the mother, it was already there, she just made it visible. That's also a result. Not the one anyone wants, but sometimes the dignity a mother recovers when she stops absorbing the intolerable is worth more than a relationship that was making her smaller every week. There are specific ways to use these phrases that make them completely ineffective. I need to tell you what they are. The first error: saying the phrase and then continuing the conversation yourself. Margaret did this in her first week. She said, "I'd rather we continue this another time," and then, because the silence felt unbearable, she filled it herself. 2 seconds later, she was back in the conversation, and Daniel learned that the phrase meant nothing. It was a comment, not a consequence. The phrase only works if what follows is exactly what you said would follow. The second error, saying the phrases with so much accumulated emotion that the message disappears inside the delivery. I worked with a woman who said the third phrase, "What you just said isn't something I'm going to let go of," with her jaw tight and her eyes fierce. Her son responded, "Mum, since when do you talk like that?" And it became another argument. The phrase is the vehicle, your internal state is the fuel. If the fuel is rage or resentment, the vehicle doesn't get where it needs to go, the emotion stays inside, the outside is calm. That combination is what creates impact. The third error, inconsistency. Using the phrases for 3 weeks, then having a good weekend where your child is warm and easy and you think, "It's fine now, this isn't necessary anymore," and letting one comment pass. Then a week later, the old patterns are back. And here's why this is the most damaging mistake of all. Inconsistency doesn't just neutralize the effect of the phrases, it teaches your child that the new system is optional, that if they wait or push hard enough, the old system returns. Intermittent reinforcement, this is established behavioral psychology, is the hardest pattern to change, precisely because it teaches the person that sometimes the pressure works, which makes them apply more pressure. If you use these phrases for 3 weeks and then stop, you haven't lost 3 weeks, but you've communicated that what you were doing was temporary, and you'll have to re-establish it from scratch. The fourth error, using the phrases as punishment. There are mothers who, after years of absorbing this, discover these tools and use them from a place of, "Now it's your turn, that's the wrong place," and children feel it immediately. They detect hostility where they should be detecting a boundary, and the response to hostility is completely different from the response to a boundary. The phrases are information. They're telling your child how this relationship functions from now on. When they're delivered from resentment, the message that lands isn't the one you intended. I know what you're thinking right now. I've heard these 4 objections more times than I can count. But if I do this, he'll think I don't care about him anymore. The people who have spent years treating someone badly with no consequence experience any limit as coldness. That's because, compared to the total absence of limits that existed before, anything registers as a dramatic shift. That doesn't mean they're right. It means the calibration of that relationship was off. Something feeling cold doesn't make it cold. What if she gets angrier? Initial anger is nearly universal, and it's actually a sign that the information landed. People only get angry when something changes that previously didn't change. If there were nothing new, there would be no new reaction. The initial anger, in the vast majority of cases, transforms into adjustment when the mother stays consistent. The danger isn't the anger. The danger is the mother, frightened by that anger, stepping back and teaching the child that anger is enough to restore the old system. My son is different. He's been through a lot. He has trauma. I'll say this clearly. A child's suffering and history can explain certain patterns of behavior. It does not make those patterns acceptable. There are people with genuinely devastating personal histories who choose every day to treat the people around them with basic respect. Trauma explains. It doesn't justify. And treating it as justification doesn't help the child. It keeps them anchored to a story where the past controls the present with no limits. What if I'm actually part of the problem? This is the most intelligent question of the 4. And the honest answer is probably yes to some degree. No one in a complicated relationship is entirely without responsibility. But being part of a dynamic doesn't mean the behavior directed at you is acceptable. Understanding your own part is work that runs parallel to setting behavioral limits, not instead of it. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and it's the thing that surprises people most. These 4 phrases don't just change how your child treats you, they change you. Something happens when a person responds to disrespect with calm and clarity for the first time in years, rather than with pain or submission. Something reorganizes. It's as if the nervous system receives the signal that what you've been bracing against all this time won't destroy you, that you can stand in front of it and remain standing. Margaret described it to me like this. She said, "I spent years being Daniel's mother in a way that made me smaller every week. I thought I needed him to change before I could feel different. But when I started using these phrases, I realized I didn't need him to change for me to stop shrinking. I could stop shrinking first." That's what these phrases do when they're properly understood. They're not a technique to manage your child. They're a way to recover the position that was always yours. And when you recover it genuinely, not as performance, but as internal fact, the relationship cannot stay the same, because what was holding the disrespect in place was specifically the absence of that position. The rule said simply, don't react to the pain, respond to the behavior, calmly, consistently, with the exact words that give your child new information about how this relationship works from now on. The first time you use one of these phrases, something in your chest will tighten. That's fine. That tightening isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're doing something new. And new things always feel unsteady at first. On the other side of that unsteadiness is something many of you haven't felt in a long time. The weight of being a person who respects herself in front of her own child. If this reached you today, leave the word respect in the comments. And if there's someone in your life who needs to hear this, a friend, a sister, another mother carrying something too heavy for too long, share this with her. A mother who holds her boundaries doesn't love less. She loves more honestly, and that matters.